On page 299, okay? Please open up your little pamphlets, page 299. What we do here, there's a couple of girls who are new, so I'm just going to say briefly, what we do is we alternate weeks. 1 week we learn Siddur, and 1 week we learn Sichos. In Siddur we have our own schedule, and in Sichos we have our own schedule. In other words, we're not learning anything which is connected to the time. It happens to be now that we're learning a Sicha Pashas B'Shalach, and it's Pashas Boy, so it's so close. But we have a Seder of learning Sichos, we have an order of learning Sichos, that's called From Exile to Redemption. The idea is that we're learning the Sichos of the Rebbe on the stories of the Chumash, in the order of the narrative of the Chumash, to expose the neshama, if you will, the soul behind the stories of the Torah. The Torah tells us stories, and of course we all understand that the stories of the Torah are not just stories. The stories of the Torah are Torah. So we undertook to do this, and this is my third syllabus in this field. We did one that was called the Oves, the Patriarchs. Then we did another one that's called Yossi and his brothers. And now, for the last couple of years, we've been doing a syllabus we labeled From Exile to Redemption. And we went through the whole story of the Golus and the Yesurim and the Makes and Yetzias Mitzrayim. And we're holding now how the Jewish people left Egypt. Pashas B'Shalach begins, which is next week's Pasha, with the Jewish people leaving Egypt, and they're going out into the desert. So 2 weeks ago, when we did this last, the conversation that we had two sides, okay? Again, if you were here 2 weeks ago, this is familiar. If you were not here 2 weeks ago, you're hearing it for the first time. And this is the issue. Hashem had a plan for the Jewish people. But you must appreciate that the plan that the Eibishter had for the Jewish people, which was to make them free, and of course making them free the way we understand it in Hasidus, is to make them the nation of God, make them Hashem's people. So this plan to make them free and to make them Hashem's people was predicated on a very, very important partnership of Yidden. If this was going to work, we would have to do something for the partnership to work. And what was expected of us then, and really always, but especially, particularly then, was to trust. To trust Hashem, to have faith, and to follow. The problem was, it was very hard for us to trust. We had been slaves for a very, very long time. And when you become a slave for a very long time, you live from meal to meal, from day to day. You don't have any control over your own life. You have no free will. You have no control over your own life. So your entire reality is your trough, is your next plate of food. That's how you live. When you become a free person and you become responsible for yourself, now you have freedom. Freedom means you can dream, you can do whatever you want, and of course, you have to take on the responsibility of looking after yourself. And only a free person can trust. Only a free person can be told, I'm going to give you something in 100 years. Believe me. If I told you I'm going to give you something in 100 years, you would say, I'm not going to be around in 100 years to pick it up. But if I told you I'm going to give you something in 10 years, you'd be very skeptical. If I told you I'm going to give you something in a year, you'd be very skeptical. If I told you I'm going to give you something in a month, you'd be very skeptical. If I told you I'm going to give you something tomorrow, you're more likely to believe me. In 5 minutes, I'm even more likely to believe me. The framework of the relationship between Yidden and Hashem, the framework for the relationship between Hashem and the Jewish people was trust. We had to believe Him. We're going out of Mitzrayim, we're going off into the desert, correct? That's what was going to happen. Right? What are we going to eat? Trust me. Where are we going to go? Trust me. Who's going to protect us? Trust me. It's very easy to say. Now, they were trusting Hashem. They weren't trusting their uncle or their father-in-law or their employer or somebody else. But it was very difficult for them. And the proof that it was difficult for them was that they keep failing the test of trust. All the complaining the Jewish people do, all of the hesitation that the Jewish people demonstrate, is a symptom of their inability to trust. They had a very hard time with trust. It was very difficult for them to trust. Why? They'd been slaves. A slave has no trust at all. And now they're expected to have maximum trust. It's not coming easy to the Jewish people. It's coming very, very hard to the Jewish people. Okay? So the Torah tells us that when you leave Mitzrayim, there's two sides to the coin. Number one, Hashem is pushing us to go as fast as possible. And of course, behind this pushing us to go as fast as possible is having maximum trust. The faster we go, the more we have to trust, the more we have to accept that we're not being misled. Correct? You get a Torah with 613 mitzvahs so quickly, and you expect it to change your entire life so quickly, and you're supposed to become a whole new person so quickly, and you're racing to keep up with Hashem. The only tool you have to keep doing this is to blindly trust. And at a certain point you say, wait, I can't do this. This is too fast. You're changing me too quickly. You're making me Jewish. You're giving me burdens. You're giving me responsibility, obligations too fast. And Hashem is going to push us as fast as He possibly can, and we're expected to deliver maximum trust and faith. That's the story. So what are the two sides of the coin? One side of the coin is Hashem is not going to push us faster than we are pushable. Hashem is not going to make us do something we can't do. In other words, if following Hashem blindly is a test of faith, Hashem knows our capacity, Hashem knows how much faith we're able to have, how much trust we're capable of delivering, and He's only going to expect that much trust from us. That's one side of the coin. And what's the other side of the coin, That anything that we could give, we must give. Hashem is going to make us work as hard as we can, not harder, and not less hard than that. You follow? So the Torah tells us the story. You didn't leave Egypt. One side of the coin, Hashem could have taken the Jewish people to Israel by going straight north. Directly above Egypt, I guess eastern Egypt is Eretz Yisrael. You can't really say western Eretz Yisrael, Eretz Yisrael is so tiny. The eastern coast of Egypt is directly south of it. So you go straight due north, and you go straight to Eretz Yisrael. So the Torah says, He doesn't take them on that route. That's too quick. In other words, Hashem assesses that much faith they don't have. He takes them into the desert. But He doesn't, his anticipation, his plan is that the trip to Eretz Yisrael should take 11 days. 11 days. Now 11 days is not a day and a half. In other words, had they gone due north, had they gone straight from Mitzrayim into Eretz Yisrael, they would have gotten to Israel in a very short time. Hashem is taking them on an 11-day journey, which is longer than the trip that they would have taken had they gone directly into Israel. But to go from being slaves to being the nation of God in 11 days is incredibly fast. Very, very fast. Okay, so you see the two sides of the coin, yes? One side of the coin is Hashem is not going to expect us to deliver a degree of trust and faith which is beyond our capacity. On the other hand, Hashem absolutely is going to expect from us to deliver a degree of trust and faith which we're capable of delivering. What happens? What happens? What happens? You know the story of the Chumash? We fail the test of faith over and over again. Hashem pushes us and pushes us and pushes us, and we can't keep up. It sounds so simple. You leave Mitzrayim, you have no food. What are you going to eat? Trust me. You go into a desert, you come to a place, the water is poison. You go to Hashem, what are you going to do? Trust me. They fail the test of trust over and over again. And of course, the end of the story is that their failing the test of trust transforms 11 days into 40 years. Instead of the Yidden being in the Midbar for 11 days, they end up spending in the Midbar a whole generation. In fact, the generation of Jewish people who go out of Mitzrayim never make it to Eretz Yisrael. They die in the desert, for the most part, by and large. Only their children go into Eretz Yisrael. So Hashem has a plan, but the plan involves us, the plan involves our free will, and we don't do very well. We fail the test of trust. We don't meet the expectations that the Eibishter has for us. You know why? Because the expectations are very high. If Hashem is going to make the Jewish nation, and they're going to be His, and they're going to be His servants, they're going to be a model for the whole world to follow, as the Eibishter intended it to be, we need to become very great very fast. And it requires a lot of faith and trust. We don't meet the challenge. So everything is delayed. And of course the delay continues till Mashiach comes. Mashiach's coming means we're ready. The Rebbe has a Sichos where the Rebbe tells the story of the Haggadah, and the whole point of that Sichos is that until Mashiach comes, we're still leaving Egypt. And the neshama of the idea is, the spirit of the idea is, that Hashem is trying to raise us up. We need to partner with Him. And if we fail the test of faith, we have to go through additional tests, additional refinements, additional challenges to meet the challenge of faith. And when we meet the challenge of faith, when we become Jews, as the Eibishter wants us to be, Mashiach comes. So what could have been a very short story turns out to be a very long story. And this is the reason why we are expected to partner. It's not a free ride. Hashem didn't create the Jewish people because He likes their noses. Hashem created the Jewish people because they represent something to the world. They represent human beings living as the Eibishter wants human beings to live, across the board. And it begins with Avraham Avinu, and Yitzchak Avinu, and Yaakov Avinu, and Sarah Imeinu, and Rivka Imeinu, and Rachel, and Leah, and Bill, and Zilpah, a few people. And then it becomes a bunch of tribes, Reuven, Shimon, Levi. And then it becomes a nation of all kinds. Tzadikim, Benyanim, Urashayim. Some of us are righteous, some of us are average, and some of us are called Rasha. And collectively we have a mission. And the foundation of this mission is to know we're different than other people, because we're the nation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that difference shows itself in how we live, based on what we believe. And we gotta believe. And we don't do so well. That's the story. Okay? This is my introduction, and if you were here 2 weeks ago, everything I just told you, I said then. Let's read. Page 299. Okay, and girls, for those who are new to this class, here's how these classes work. I read only what I underlined, which means if you follow me inside, you won't have any trouble. Just look at the words underlined. And I'm going to read every word that's underlined. Believe me, I won't read any of the words that are not underlined. So if you hang in there with the underlined words, you'll know where I'm reading. Otherwise, you won't know where I'm reading. If you really want to know or you want to know, ask me and I'll tell you. Here we go. Go ahead, ma'am.
Were Hashem's expectations too high?
Hashem's the manufacturer of the machine.
Okay.
So you got to assume He's got a pretty good idea what He created.
Yeah.
I mean, it stands to reason that if we could have accomplished in 11 days what's taken 4,000 years, it must have been pretty intense, huh? Yeah.
At the same time, if you're training for the Olympics, that's 4 years. You're going to trust your coach that he's going to get you there. You're not going to complain. You're going to eat what he tells you. You're going to go train twice a day. You can get to the Olympics in 4 years.
Well, first of all, it's much more complicated than that.
I understand.
I could train for 40 years and I will never get to the Olympics. I don't know about you, but most people are not going to the Olympics. Anybody who makes it to the Olympics is gifted. Is in a class that's much less than 1% of the population.
But Yidden were gifted. That's why.
Yidden were a nation. Avraham was gifted. Yidden had all types. They had good ones, bad ones, rotten ones. They had all types. We're a people. That's the whole thing. We went from being individuals to becoming a nation. And a nation does not only have good apples, it has bad apples. And we're collectively given a task. And we have to do it as a collective, we do it as a group, as a unit. And understand that when you prepare for the Olympics, what you are training for is to compete in a physical exercise. Right. That's very, very limited. Okay, if I gave you 4 years to prepare to be of perfect character, and of sound body and mind, and to have a philosophy of life which is not only moral and ethical, but based on principles of something that is divine. 4 years is enough. They weren't preparing to run a race. They were preparing to represent God in this world.
Then why did He choose the 11 days?
Because He knew that they could meet that challenge.
Right.
But it would have been perfect. The amount of trust they would have needed would have been wow. Okay, here we go. Ala pasuk v'leinacham v'goyim. The Torah tells us the story that Hashem does not take the Jewish people on the shortest route into Eretz Yisrael. The shortest route into Eretz Yisrael is to go directly from Mitzrayim straight up into Eretz Yisrael. They would meet the Plishtim who lived in the southern part of Eretz Yisrael, and the Plishtim been a thorn in our eye for hundreds and hundreds of years, and we would have failed that test. Hashem knew that test is too severe, but Isa b'medrash, the medrash says, Mimitzrayim l'Eretz Yisrael Yud Aleph Masois. The journey from Egypt to Israel is 11 stops. Now, the way I understand this medrash, this 11 stops is not Derech Eretz Plishtim. Derech Eretz Plishtim is even less than that. So the way we're reading this is that Hashem, like I said to you, Hashem manufactured the machine. He knows what he can expect. For Yidden to go directly to Eretz Yisrael due north was too difficult. But 11 stops or 11 days was realistic. What ends up happening, however, is that those 11 days turn into 40 years because of a series of setbacks, right? It says in the Mishnah, Pirkei Avos, it's based on a pasuk in Chumash, in Parshas Shlach, Vayinasu oisi zeh esa pa'amim v'leshamu b'keli. In the span of 18 months, the Jewish people test God 10 times. And don't listen to him. 10 times. 10 times they fail the test of faith in a year and a half. And of course the culmination of this was when they don't want to go into Eretz Yisrael, they want to stay in the Midbar, and Hashem finally says, okay, I'm going to give you what you want. You'll live out your life in the desert, I'm going to wait your children to grow up, I'm taking your kids. And it ends up becoming 40 years. So all of this denotes what? What do all this say? That Hashem had a plan, we messed it up, and we got a lesser quality plan, right? That's what it sounds like. We were supposed to get something better. We failed the challenge. We didn't meet the challenge we were given to us. We were given a different plan. So here goes the Sicha. Those 11 days or those 11 journeys turned into 40 years. That says in the beginning of Sefer Devarim, it's the beginning of Deuteronomy. We were 11 days from Sinai. In other words, 11 days or 11 journeys from going into the Holy Land, and instead it takes 40 years. And instead, it took 40 years. Which is the meaning of the words of Nachum Elokim. He didn't take them on a short route, he took them on a long route. And again, I'm speaking into this two ideas. Number one, Hashem doesn't take them on a trip which was incredibly short. And number two, even the planned trip that the Eibishter had, which was taking me into Eretz Yisrael in 11 days, also turns into 40 years. So now, girls, basically it means we failed. That's what it means, right? We were given a job, we were given a task, and we didn't meet it. We were told, believe, trust, follow, and we couldn't. Bad, right? What was the consequence? Hashem doesn't abandon us. That's not part of the plan. But he has to modify his plans in order to get us where we need to go. And the modification is 11 days turns into 40 years. So the Rebbe says a simple thing. So that means 40 years in the desert was all a bust. 40 years in the Midbar was all one big negative. It's one big failure. We're supposed to do it in 11 days. It's taking 40 years. That means we wasted 39 years, 11 months, and 19 days. That's the question. So the question is that the whole story? Is that what happened? That we messed it up and we were set back 40 years and nothing good comes from it? So of course we know, as the expression is, that every cloud has a silver lining. And in the language of Torah, we call this Yerida Tzeirech Aliyah. When we're set back, when we mess up and we have to do things differently or over or with tests or for a longer period of time, even though it's our own fault, we made a mistake. We didn't meet the Eibishter's challenge and we're, so to speak, paying for the missing of that challenge, right? We always say, if Jewish people mess something up and there's a consequence, we never say that the consequence is only negative. There's got to be a positive spin. So that's what the Rebbe does in the Sicha. We spent 40 years in the desert. Why? We couldn't meet the challenge of the Eibishter. But I'm going to ask you the question one more time. We spent 40 years in the desert. Why? Because of those 40 years, something happened that would not have happened had we done it in 11 days. So that's what happens now. The Rebbe spins the Sicha. And he says, what we said before is true. That it took us 40 years to get that to Yisrael because we made a mistake. But what we're saying now is also true. Even though we spent 40 years because we made a mistake, something good came out of those 40 years, which we would not have had we gotten it so quickly. And what happens? We elevated sparks. We collected wealth from the world. Let's read it inside. V'yashleima, 299 second column. I want to add, says the Rebbe, Shekavonas HaKadosh Baruch Hu Bekach, that when the Eibishter intends in saying, Shalei Nocham, Vayasev, Derech HaMidbar, that he doesn't take them on the shorter route, he takes them on a longer route, and ultimately takes them on a route which takes 40 years. Yud Aleph Masais, these 11 journeys, Nosam HaKadosh Baruch Hu Derech HaMidbar Mem Shana, turns into 40 years. So now, it seems to us, we would imagine, this is all bad. It's a not good thing. It shouldn't have happened. It would have been better and more proper and more wonderful if we didn't waste 40 years, if we did it in 11 stops. But there's another way to look at it. Because those 40 years were not a waste of time. Those 40 years not only gave us the emunah, the trust necessary to do what we needed to do when we went into Exile, we actually gained an advantage. What is the advantage? Let's read on. Hishabechinas achad asa, the level of 11. Parenthesis. The number 11 represents the one which is above 10. Because everything in Torah goes in the number 10, right? There are 10 sfiras in godliness. There are 10 commandments. There's also 10 utterances of creation. 11 is higher than 10. 11 represents the one which is higher than the 10. Tumshach v'tizgala b'pnimiyusa should be drawn down and revealed into the Jewish people al yedei ha'alicha b'midbar, by walking through the desert b'meshach habayim shar, for those 40 years. So what the Rebbe is saying in plain English is, we made a mistake, we paid the price, but we gained, we benefited. We benefited in a very, very, very real way. What did we gain? We gained the number 11. We gained the number 11. Now girls, no long speeches, but short speeches. Okay, turn the page. I'm going to say this very, very quickly. I don't know how much Hasidus you've learned. I don't know how much Kabbalah you've been exposed to. You've been around, right? I mean, I'm assuming that you've been in school for a while, and you've learned some Torah and learned some Hasidus. But you know about the idea of Esses, right? There's 10 Sfiras. Yeah. It's written in Kabbalah, and it's hinted to in Tanya and the Maimorim, that the difference between Kedusha and Klipa, the difference between holiness and unholiness or anti-holiness, is the difference between the number 10 and the number 11. Kedusha, everything is in 10. In Klipa, everything is 11. And there are many allusions, there's many examples for where you see that Klipa is the number 11. First of all, there's a reason why. There's a reason why Klipa is the number 11. And the reason is because there's an assumption that the life of Klipa, the soul of Klipa, which is godliness, and the Klipa itself have to remain separate. Because if the life of Klipa and the Klipa itself would join, they would die very quickly. Klipa lives from Hashem, just like Kedusha does. But Klipa's whole identity is, I take from God and I deny He's feeding me. My mother gives me food and I tell her I hate her. And she keeps feeding me. It's a special trick. That's what Klipa is. It takes from the Eibishter and denies it. So the Eibishter himself has to be separate from the Klipa. Which is why in Kedusha we speak about the number 10, and in Klipa we speak about the number 11. The 11th is the Eibishter that's removed from the Klipa. Okay? So, the number, and by the way, the best example for the number 11 in Torah and Yiddishkeit is the Ketores. The Ketores was incense that was burnt in the Beis HaMikdash every morning and every night. In our Tefillah syllabus a couple of years ago, we touched on the Ketores. It was the end of the school year, so we did it very quickly. But we touched on the Ketores at that point. And the Ketores has 11 species, 11 types. And it's brought to Chassidus from Kabbalah because the idea of the Ketores is to transform Klipa. Even Klipa is transformed into Kedusha. Even evil, or absolute evil, is transformed into Kedusha through the avodah of the Ketores. So the number 11 represents Klipa. What's the Rebbe's argument? 11 days turns into 40 years means that we captured from Klipa and we brought it into Kedusha. Had we gone into Eretz Yisrael in 11 days, we'd have had maximum trust, maximum faith. We would have achieved a connection to HaKadosh Baruch, which would have been very great. And of course, as the cliché goes, we would have brought Mashiach then, but we would have missed all the sparks that would have left behind. The 40 years in the Midbar, the 40 years in the desert, which are a consequence of an error, right? They're the consequence of a mistake. They're a consequence of something that we did wrong. But every Yerida has an Aliyah. Every bad has to have a good. What is the good? 11 days turns into 40 years, and we capture the number 11. That's how the Rebbe explains it. And I'm going to read it inside. I'm on page 300, okay? On page 300, which is a Sefer HaSichos Tafshin and Beis. the first column, and again, I'm reading the underlines. Anybody wants a copy? There are copies abound. There should be more copies. If anybody just walked in late, these are the same sikh I gave you 2 weeks ago. If you were here, you got it. But there are more copies around. And I'm reading it inside. You ready? Here we go. Inyan zeh merumez. This idea that the Jewish people turn 11 days into 40 years, which is not good, but that the upside of turning 11 days into 40 years is the so-called capture of the number 11, which means we take sparks of klipa and bring them into the reshus of kedusha, which would not have happened if we had done it very quickly. Says the Rabbi is also hinted in the very beginning of the passage. It's a famous teaching, and originally it's from the Mezritcher Maggid, I believe. It's in footnote 52. The Jewish people leave Egypt and the Pharaoh sends them out. Right? That's how part of the B'Shalach begins. And it was when the Pharaoh sent the Jewish people out of Egypt. Now, of course, simply speaking, what does this mean? We all learned the Chumash, right? This is the Chitas of tomorrow. That a Pare gets up in the middle of the night, right? And does anybody remember what he's wearing? Polka dot pajamas and a nightcap with a pom-pom. Very important. The machlekes is only what the color of the polka dots were. And he comes running, it says in Rashi, where does Moshe live? And he throws him out. Now the Hebrew word for throwing somebody out is gedushin, like divorce. The beginning of Parshas B'Shalach does not use the word gedushin, it uses the word B'Shalach, which means to send. So it says in Chassidus, Vahi b'shalach pari es'am she'reimez al pari de gedusha. This is an allusion to the Pharaoh of holiness, which is bechinas chamishis lefare, the fifth level, which belongs to the Pharaoh, which is higher than ishtalshalos. The ispiriyu ve'izgalyin minei kol nahed. That pari, which means a level of godliness, which is above all order and reveals all lights, takes the people, Jewish people, out of Mitzrayim. However, this idea that b'shalach parei ha'am, that when the Jewish people left Egypt, they were leaving Egypt because the koyach eliki, which was throwing them out of Egypt, was a very, very high one. Hu hatam, that's the explanation. Lahem shachakosov, to what follows. That v'leinacham elakim v'yaseh v'gei mederech hamidbar b'meshach 40 shana. That at 11 days turns into 40 years has to do with the fact that Pare, which means the Pare of holiness, sends them out of Mitzrayim. Why? Kedei shebechinas Pare de Gedusha, the Pharaoh of holiness, Tumshach bepnimiyis, should be internalized. That means, if Yidden go into Mitzrayim very fast, it'll be very wonderful. But they'll be missing out on a lot. If Yidden go into Mitzrayim very, very fast, what are they going to be missing out on? They're going to miss out on the number 11. If Yidden go into Mitzrayim very rapidly, they'll take with them only the number 10, which basically means Kedusha. What are they going to be missing? Two things. The number 11, which is Klipa, the negative idea of number 11, which we'll talk about momentarily. And the parallel of that, the number 11, which is Kedusha. The number 11 of Kedusha is also much, much higher than Kedusha, much higher than the 10. The number 11 of Klipa is much lower than the 10, and they're interconnected. In other words, when we elevate sparks, we reach higher than Kedusha, and we reach the Madrega of 11. So if the trip to Eretz Yisrael happens as planned, Yidden go into Eretz Yisrael very, very quickly, and they have with them only the number 10, Kedusha itself. The fact that that plan is prolonged, delayed, which has to do with us and our lack of faith, has an incredible upside. It allows us to access the number 11 of Kedusha and the number 11 of Le'umah. Let's keep reading. Okay, second column, page 300. More specifically, it actually plays itself out. It all unfolds as it's described later on in the Parsha, which includes Halichas b'nei Yisrael b'Midbar, the journey of the Jewish people through the desert. Now what happens? It takes time. And they keep moving and stopping and moving and stopping. During the detailed steps of their 42 journeys, which happens over the course of 40 years. Now, of course, if they go into Israel in 11 days, they're not making 40 stops. So the fact that it was all delayed and prolonged resulted in many, many more stops. Hochel mehamasoy shebeparsha seinu, beginning with the journeys in our parsha. Vayisam misukes vayachanu be'esam b'ksei Midbar ubrat lachar kiyas Yamsuf vayisa vayetzel Midbar shor vayisu vayavel Midbar sin vayism basin l'masayim v'geber. Next paragraph, please. For those who lost the place, page 300, second column, second paragraph. Yadua says that, but we know. Shetachas hakavana b'alichas b'nei Yisrael b'Midbar. When we journey through the desert and we take our time. Why are we taking our time? Because we don't have enough faith to go any faster. Not good. But when we take our time going through the desert because we don't have the faith to go any faster, something good is happening as well. What's the good? We're living in that foreign place and we're bringing holiness to that foreign place. It brings clarity, separation to the sparks of holiness that have fallen in the so-called desert of the nations. The source of klipas from a very, very high source. And as a consequence of the Jewish people bringing clarity to these sparks of holiness, bring them back to the root and their source, it reveals in the Jewish people this highest of levels. In other words, the 40 years in the desert, which are based on a negative, have a huge positive. The huge positive is that by being 40 years in the desert, we elevate the desert. We find the sparks in the desert. The desert itself is klipa. So the sparks in the desert are represented by the number 11. The reward for spending those 40 years in the desert and dealing with the desert and elevating the sparks in the desert is that we access the 11 of Kedusha, which is even higher than, say, the Ishtalshlos. So it's, as the expression is, 6 of one, a half a dozen of another, right? That's the same thing. 6 of one, a half a dozen are the same thing. But in this case, it's not the same thing, right? A tzaddik has a short trip that goes straight. A Baal Tshuva has a circuitous route that goes in zigzags, both end up in the same place. So you look at it superficially, you say, well, the tzaddik gets there quick, he's doing it right. The Baal Tshuva makes all these bumps and bruises and back and forth and back and forth. It takes it forever to get to the same end. Right? No, wrong. The Baal Tshuva brings to God even his Avedas and makes them holy. The tzaddik can't. So it's not either or, it's both. You need to have both. I'll tell you something very interesting. I got a message from a former student of mine. And whenever you get such a question, you know right away that it's a personal question. For those who learn Rambam, I don't know if you learn Rambam. I would imagine that you don't learn Rambam. But those of us who learn Rambam and learn one chapter a day of Rambam, we learn the laws of Karbanos. And there's a whole bunch of halachas regarding laws of Karbanos that you're not allowed to use an animal which is blemished. And a kohen who's in any way deformed, disfigured, handicapped is not allowed to avoid in the Beis HaMikdash. Now, in the PC world of the 21st century America, that is evil. Because a person is a cripple, he can't do the avoid in the Beis HaMikdash. Because the person is blind, he can't do the avoid in the Beis HaMikdash. Because the person has one kind of liability or another. You should be sensitive. So he sent me this question. Can you explain to me what's the upside of the dinim of Balei Mum? An animal has to be perfect, a perfect physical specimen. The animal has any kind of wound, not good for the Beis HaMikdash. The kohen has to be a perfect specimen. If one leg is longer than the other, if one eye is larger than the other, if one arm is longer than the other, there's something like 73 different reasons a kohen can do. If he's left-handed, he can't do it in the Beis HaMikdash. Right? So he sent me this note, and it happens to be that on my website, InsideChasidus.org, that today is going through Baruch Hashem, a great facelift. Look how shameless I am. I have a class on this. I guess in Pashas Achri Moise Kedoshim with halachas v'zam mumim. It's based on a mind from Tzemach Tzedek. So he sent me this question. So initially I told him where to look, and then I came back to him and I gave him the answer in short. And that is, you can ask a more basic question. Why does Hashem create people with disabilities? Why did Hashem create people with all kinds of problems? Right? We love to say in our very, very modern and enlightened world that God is mean and angry and bad and tough and cruel, and how could a kind God make so much suffering and so on and so forth? My answer to that question is that that's an oversimplification and a falsehood. Almost all that happens in this world that God does is pretty good. And when stuff happens and not good, 9 times out of 10 we did it. And then 1 time out of 10 that the Eibush did it, it has a purpose. But I don't want to have this conversation now. Hashem creates people with deficiencies, with liabilities, because He wants something different from them. Every person has a different task. The only thing we have in common is that everyone has a mission, and everyone has what they need to fulfill their mission. Period. But the missions aren't the same. So when a person doesn't like the hand they've been dealt, and they wish they had a different hand, what's the answer? The Eibishter didn't give us that choice. He decides who we should be. He decides what we must do. Our job is to embrace the life we have and not wish for a different life. One of the most tragic human conditions possible is a person who lives his life with jealousy. And one of the most wholesome human conditions of life is to be happy with what you have. The Mishnah says, the Birkei Avos, if you're happy with what you have, you're rich. A greater truism has never been told. It's a fact of life. You can have everything in the world and be miserable. You can have almost nothing and be very, very rich if you accept the life you've been dealt. So why did the Eibush make people to be invalids and handicapped and compromised and so on and so forth? So I told them there's a Maimon from Tzemach Tzedek, which is based on a Maimon from the Alter Rebbe, of course. And basically the idea is there's two models. Just like in the Tanya there's a Tzaddik and there's the Baal Tshuva. In the Beis HaMikdash is a Tzaddik and the Baal Tshuva. The Tzaddik is the Kohen. He's a perfect physical specimen. Physically perfect because spiritually he's also whole. He has an avodah. A tzaddik, a kohen who's handicapped, can't do an avodah in the Beis HaMikdash. He represents the Baal Tshuva. And in Jewish life, there's inside the temple and outside the temple. There's two different paths to God. There's the inside the Beis HaMikdash path. There's the outside the Beis HaMikdash path. And by the way, they're represented by Yom Kippur and Purim. Yom Kippur is the most perfect approach to a relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and at the heart of it you have Goydel, which means a lottery. Purim is the most unideal circumstance of relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's also revolving around the Goydel, around the lottery. That's what Purim and Yom Kippur share. But it's the Baal Tshuva version of the same, and it's celebrated in the most opposite ways. Yom Kippur, everyone's an angel, and Purim, life's a party. Both of them are serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu. One is one model, one is the other model. In other words, if you decide that Judaism is about the Beis HaMikdash, then the Torah is not being fair to handicapped people. But Judaism is not about the Beis HaMikdash, it's about the Beis HaMikdash also. And there is an inside-the-box model and there's an outside-the-box model. The thing that's hard for us to appreciate is we were not given a choice. Hashem didn't say, well, you're going to be a tzaddik or a Baal Tshuva. He just gives us a task. Our job is to do what we can and to embrace the person we're made to be. So a person who's handicapped has advantages of people who are not handicapped. It's just different advantages. And when you embrace who you are, you can become a giant. You know, I'm sure you've heard about this, and if you haven't, you're about to. The Rebbe spoke a Sichos to the what do they call themselves? The Nichoei Tzahal. After the Yom Kippur War, Israel had hundreds of young men whose physical lives had been ruined. And some of these people had been so physically fit, and now they were blind, or they had no legs. So they were, it's unfathomable. Imagine being a young, healthy person. Now you become so dependent. It's very depressing. Anyway, they came to America to join what's called the Paralympics, the Special Olympics. And many of them were very depressed. And of course, their complaint always was that when people would talk to them, they felt patronized. Nobody was honest with them. You fought for Israel. Yeah, your brother died for Israel. You survived without eyes for Israel, and people are just pitying you. And they were disgusted by it. Anyway, there was an arrangement made for them to come see the Rebbe. The Rebbe came downstairs and spoke to them in Hebrew, and did something very out of character. Instead of them lining up to get dollars from the Rebbe walked through the rows and handed each one $1, shook each one's hand, and thanked him for what he did for the Jewish people. I'm sorry. Anyway, the Rebbe spoke to them. That talk is about 15 minutes long. It's one of the most incredible talks of the Rebbe. It's very, very famous and popular. What the Rebbe did was he used very simple logic to present a perspective on their lives. He said it's a physical and a physiological fact. And I'm using my words, okay, but the Rebbe spoke in simpler words. The Rebbe said it's so simple, but it's so simple to understand. What happens to people who can't see? What happens to people who are blind?
They hear better.
They develop an incredible sense of hearing, a stronger sense of smell, an incredible sense of touch. I saw a scientific article They talk about evolution. Here I am wasting time again. I am terrible. When they talk about evolution of living things, right, what is considered the most advanced sense? What is considered the highest of the five senses? In other words, from an evolutionary standpoint, what did living creatures develop last? Eyes. What's the most primitive of the five senses?
Smell.
Touch. Now, between seeing and touch, there are three, right? Smelling, tasting, and hearing. Of the three, smelling is the lowest. Tasting is considered more advanced. Actually, I think tasting may be lower than smell. But certainly hearing is considered a higher sense than smell and taste. Now, by the way, we don't believe in evolution. God created all of us with all five senses. But if you'll study animals, more primitive animals, the most primitive animals, navigate the world with touch. Animals that are less primitive navigate the world through smell and taste. Animals which are more sophisticated navigate the world with sound. The most sophisticated animals navigate the world with eyesight. And if you know anything about what's called binocular vision, primates have their eyes situated in their head that they can actually measure distances because the small separation between the two eyes that focus on a common point at the same time. Animals have their eyes in the side of their head, actually see two different things. And if you're an animal that people like to eat, that's better. But if we have an ability to measure distances because we have two eyes and they converge on one spot. That's why people who are cross-eyed have a problem measuring distance. This is all explicable. So one of the most primitive senses is smell. They have found populations of human beings. So of course the idea is that if you have better eyes, you're going to have worse ears and worse noses because you don't need it. They have found populations of people who live in jungles whose sense of smell exceeds any expectation of a human being. Because you know how it works. Animals who navigate the world by smell have a huge part of the brain that's dedicated to smell. We have a tiny part of the brain that's dedicated to smell because we don't need that sense of smell. But there are human beings on this earth today, talk about evolution, whose olfactory sense is more important to them, and the part of the brain that's do with smell is bigger, and they smell things you and I would never smell. So much for evolution. Because you use your senses in a compensatory way. If you have a problem with your eyes, you begin to use your ears in a way you never knew how. And the brain adapts. You become capable of hearing things nobody else can hear. You smell things nobody else can smell. And you certainly feel things when you touch. So the Rebbe said, any human being who's compromised in one area naturally adapts and becomes exceptional in other areas. So the Rebbe says, instead of calling you Nechei Tzahal, you should be called Mitzuyanei Tzahal. That's where this idea comes from. You're exceptional. Why? Because the lack of balance in your life, that means a healthy human being, but has a balance of seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and touching. None of those senses are extra acute. A person who's missing one of those automatically becomes exceptional in the other senses. And the Rebbe says you should be identified by that. Not by what you're missing, but how you're correcting it. That's what the Rebbe told him. It's so wise, it's so realistic, and it's so kind. The Rebbe said, these challenges that you have, right now they make you feel like less than a human being. But understand, it's an opportunity. You can now compensate for what you're lacking in other areas, in other ways, and become exceptional. You're not going to get your eyesight back. You're not going to get back your ability to touch, to walk, but you'll be able to live a full life. Embrace what you are. That's the key. Embrace what you are. So getting back to the original point, the Eibishter made a Beis HaMikdash. If you see Judaism as the temple, then the Torah is insensitive to people who are invalids, who are handicapped. But Judaism is not the Beis HaMikdash. Beis HaMikdash is a part of Judaism. The other part of Judaism is the world. And the handicapped person who can't go into the Beis HaMikdash is in service outside the Beis HaMikdash, and in certain ways he exceeds what the Kohen, who's, quote, perfect, is doing within the parameters, within the walls of the Beis HaMikdash. Because we have different contributions to make. What the Jewish people accomplish is collaborative. We support each other, and those of us who are, so to speak, handicapped in one area compensate by doing it in other areas. Why did I give you this whole little speech right there? Because that's what happens. 11 days turns into 40 years. Bad. Right? We compensate. You don't just lose. You adapt. So, okay, 11 days turns to 40 years because we couldn't keep up with Eibishter. So what upside is there to these 11 years, 40 years? And the Rebbe says the number 11. That's the advantage. If we do this in 11 days, all we have is the number 10. Because we lost out on one side, we compensate and adapt and gain on the other side. What are we gaining on the other side? What we're getting on the other side is the number 11. What is the number 11? Two things. Godliness, which is totally above Ishtalshus, which is called Paray, and godliness, which is beneath the Ishtalshus, which is called Klipa. And the 40 years in the desert allow us to transform Klipa into Kedusha, which is turning the negative 11 into something good and bringing down the 11 of Kedusha. So the Rebbe says 40 years in the desert is a setback, but it's not only negative. There's a tremendous upside. We served a purpose in those 40 years in the Midbar that would have been missed had we hastened the Yisrael. Let's keep reading. V'ha'inyin bazeh, page 300, last few lines. Idea is the sparks of holiness that have fallen into the so-called desert of the nations. Shorsham, its root is mebechinas achad osar shalamayla meishtalshus, comes from the number 11, which is above ishtalshus. In other words, what is lower has a higher source. And to say it in psychological terms, when a person is compromised, they go deeper into their nefesh, and they find strength to live and to survive and to succeed by compensating for their lack. So the setback, the liability becomes a strength. If you embrace your life, 11 days turns into 40 years. We compensated that liability and gained something which we should have lost had we not had the setback. Top of page 301 now. In our efforts, in the clarification of sparks, and bringing them back to the root and source, which is the number 11 of holiness, and it brings down this number 11 into us. Kedusha is in the number 10. 11 is either higher than Kedusha or lower than Kedusha. How do you get to the number 11, which is higher than Kedusha? Through the number 11, which is beneath Kedusha. The 40 years in the desert put us in touch with the number 11, which is beneath Kedusha, and gave us access to the number 11, which is above Kedusha. And through this, Nitesef Etzlam, the Jewish people gain a huge advantage. An incredible advantage. In comparison or in contrast to what would have been our service to Hashem had we only been involved in inyanim of Torah mitzvahs, which is Aseres HaDibros, only 10 commandments. Hakshurim im eses sfiras, only 10 sfiras, which is Shleimus HaKedusha, it's the perfection of holiness, but it's b'medida v'hagabala. It has a measure and it has a limit. So what did we learn? This is our first Sikh on Pashat B'Shalach. We leave Mitzrayim. I gave you a huge introduction about this issue of faith and failing the test of faith, okay? And then we're saying there's an upside. The upside is that the 40 years in the Midbar gave us a huge advantage.